2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Jim, a few things are afoot. One of those topics, one of those situations where sometimes the pollies just want to, you know what, we'll leave that for somebody else. The concept of religious freedom protections. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. Yes, although the House of Reps won't be sitting till next week, I think, but the Attorney General will be taking a submission to Cabinet for consideration about how they might frame a religious discrimination bill or some such name. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of curious because there's not a huge public demand. It's not like that members of the majority of citizens are sort of jumping up and down and saying, hey, we want religious freedom. In fact, most people think that things are pretty reasonable, and less than 4 in 10 people think anything needs to be done at all. There is concern, of course, around people's employment and the conditions of employment in which, and in the case, say, of someone like Israel Folau, that, you know, if you're employed by somebody, what terms and conditions govern what you can say outside of your workplace. That's an employment issue. It's not a religious freedom issue. The question of religious freedom, the Constitution provides some protection, but we need to understand that what the protection in the Constitution is preventing the Australian government from enacting legislation that imposes a particular religion on the rest of the Australian society. Now, in that context, we need to also understand that it wasn't about imposing Christianity versus, shall we say, Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever. It was actually, in the time, about the different denominations, Catholics and Anglicans, in the early days of the colonial period when they were coming together to form the Australian nation. And there was concern that the Australian government might legislate to favour one religion over one denomination over another. So within the Australian constitutional context, the sort of idea of freedom of religion, while generalisable, had a specific historical dimension. The other aspect of that was that religion was a matter for the states in most cases, and each state has some level of religious freedom or legislation protecting religious freedom or preventing discrimination on the grounds of religion. Some states have stronger protections than others. So one of the things that the Attorney General will be looking at is how we might, that is to say, how the government might ensure that the Commonwealth legislation provides the protection that ensures that every state has roughly the same sorts of protections in place and that there's consistency between Commonwealth and state so that an individual or an organisation can't play the state off against the Commonwealth.
Firstly, good luck with all of that. But secondly, so for those who aren't really up on all this, the actual potential change that is being floated around and where that may, why some potentially may think, no.
Well, it's difficult to say exactly what the specific changes might be. At the moment, there is some level of agreement that changes protecting children at school so that the sexuality of a young adolescent in high school is not grounds for expulsion or refusal for them to attend that school. So there's that dimension, and I think there's a reasonable amount of agreement on the surface, at least across the parliamentary divide, that's one of the things that should be dealt with under this legislation. The difficulty here, Mark, though, is that the push for some sort of legislation has come from, in many respects, the far more conservative quarters of the coalition parties. And part of this has been driven by the same-sex marriage debate that we had a couple of years ago, and the outcome of that was not what they wanted. And certainly when the Prime Minister, back then when he was Treasurer, made a clear point that it was one of his missions in life that he would try and ensure that the advantages that might have accrued to, shall we say, non-traditional sexualities and so forth, gets rolled back, that he would pursue legislation that would protect the mainstream religions or whatever, and which it seemed a bit strange at the time, but whether he has stepped back from that position remains to be seen. On the one hand, one would expect him to step back a little because mainstream Australia, from all the polls that have been done, have little or no interest in what some of the hardline conservatives in his party are on about. The other dimension, though, is that we never quite know exactly where some of these individuals are going to stand on these particular issues. So it's a matter of waiting and seeing what Mr Porter, the Attorney-General, what he puts to the Cabinet, and then what debates happen in the Cabinet and what the outcome of that might be. But if I can put one slight other aspect of this, part of the rationale for some of the hardline positions taken by the hardline conservatives, not, shall we say, the more traditional conservatives, but the hardline conservatives, it's largely about rolling back some of the gains that we might say are part of the changing gender order of the past sort of 50 years, where particular traditions have now been sort of turned back a little, that there are more women in the workforce, there are more women with power, there are gay men and women who are occupying positions of power who have a degree of respectability that they would not have had 60 or 70 years ago. We have more tolerance and encouragement, if you like, of a greater presence of LGBT people in the community and in the workforce. So part of this is driven by a sense of these changes need to be rolled back. We've, for many of these people, it's that we've gone too far with this. Yet, that's only a minority of one part of the coalition. The rest of the country seems to be relatively comfortable with most things. And like I said, provided that people are protected from unfair discrimination on the basis of their religion, most people would think that there's no need to be too carried away with the legislation.
All right, we'll wait and see what the announcements look like and the inevitable debate that will follow. Jim, thank you as always for your time and insights.
My pleasure, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics, Jim Jose, this morning on 2NURFM 103.7.